Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and we are exploring the beautiful region of the Cotswolds in southwest England, following in the trail of Herbert Evans, who cycled around this region and wrote about his experiences in this wonderful book, The Highways and Byways in Oxford and the Cotswolds, published in 1905, 114 years ago. This is the start of episode 3 of our half-hour compilations with new footage of little villages and landmarks, beginning on the western escarpment of the Cotswolds in the village of Winchcombe. The story of this town begins in Neolithic times. As far back as 3,000 years BC, people lived and died here. Just south of the town is a long barrow, a Neolithic burial chamber, which, after its excavation and restoration in the late 1920s, is now probably one of the best preserved examples of its kind in the country. As we've discovered before in nearby Stow, the Romans were extremely active in this area, and the remains of 2 Roman villas are to be found just outside Winchcombe, suggesting that the river crossing at the bottom of the valley brought people here to farm. But it was in the Saxon era that Winchcombe became a serious player. King Offa of Mercia founded a nunnery here in the 8th century AD, which later became Winchcombe Abbey, a major Benedictine centre and a place of great learning. Nothing remains of the abbey now, but bits of its stone can be found incorporated into several existing buildings. Up until now, we've visited, as you know, many villages and towns, all of which I've either seen before or read a great deal about. I've never visited Winchcombe before now, and it has come as a complete surprise. The first exciting thing has been the approach to this bustling metropolis. Widget and I came down over the hills from Stow through some of the most extraordinary villages I've ever seen, winding along incredibly narrow lanes, up and down the steepest possible slopes. We've stumbled across little communities which look virtually unchanged, certainly in the 100 years since Evans was there, but seemingly for hundreds of more years before that. This part of the Cotswolds really is extraordinary. Winchcombe was mentioned, of course, in the Domesday Book of 1086, and whilst the abbey thrived, pilgrims came from far and wide to visit the shrine to St Kenelm, situated in the abbey itself, and also to the Cistercian monastery at Hales, a couple of miles north of the village, where they displayed a phial said to contain the blood of Christ. This kind of tourism sustained the village well, and of course they benefited also from the wool trade, which was such a big part of the Cotswolds' successes in the Middle Ages. The monasteries were, however, in decline, and at the dissolution in 1539, Winchcombe's fortunes also suffered. By the early 1800s, the people here were looking for alternative ways to make a living. They took the controversial route of growing tobacco, which annoyed the authorities, who saw it as competition for their plantations in Virginia. Not for the first time, we see that part of the reason for the unspoiled beauty of this village is the lack of constant commercial success. This meant the buildings were largely unchanged and development was minimal. When Evans passed through here in 1904, he stayed at the White Hart, which we're about to visit in a minute or two. But he wrote in his book, "As I passed the George," which is where I'm standing, on my way to my quarters at the White Hart, I noticed the letters R.K. carved upon the old lintel on the archway, which is just above me here. These are the initials of Richard Kidderminster, the wealthy abbot in the time of Henry VII. Like many other Winchcombe monk, he studied at Gloucester, now Worcester College in Oxford, which was then frequented by members of all the great Benedictine monasteries in the province of Canterbury. This ancient pub is now being converted into flats, but retaining its medieval pilgrims' gallery and courtyard. So, here I am outside the White Hart Hotel, where Evans stayed in 1904. Ross and I are going to go in and have a cup of coffee. The beautiful countryside surrounding Winchcombe is crisscrossed with footpaths, nice and level along the river for the less energetic of you, but also up and over the surrounding hills. Ross, Widget and I are taking the one to nearby Sudeley Castle, which we're hoping to visit in more detail in the near future, and which plays a key part in the checkered history of the area. The main difference between this place and most of the towns of this size that we visited before is that Winchcombe is not a market town. It has no great square to give the town a sort of undisputed centre. The place meanders. Beautiful ancient streets stretch in all directions, lined with shops and restaurants and hotels and pubs, everything that a civilized human being should need. And yet it retains a sort of residential, cosy feel. As you can probably hear, I've rather fallen for this place. I think it's remarkable. I wonder where the nearest estate agent is. We're now travelling north about 1.5 miles to visit the ruined abbey of Hales. Descending from Farmcott through the wood, we find ourselves in a green coombe, shut in by hills on all sides except the north. On our right is the parish church. In the meadow on our left, a square plot enclosed by 4 ruined walls. This is the cloister garth of the once famous Cistercian monastery of Hales. Nothing else remains. The splendid church, the conventual buildings, the approaches, the gatehouse, the precinct walls, all have gone. There is nothing above ground but these ruined walls to tell of the vast edifice of which they once formed so small a part. A few years would suffice for the destruction of all that for 3 centuries had been the object of veneration. Neither here nor at Winchcombe, 2 miles away, was it any outburst of popular fanaticism or any violent manifestation of popular hostility that overthrew the shrines and pulled down the walls of these 2 magnificent churches. The demolition was deliberate and systematic. It was a mere matter of business proceeding upon a cool calculation of profit and loss. That these buildings were landmarks in the history of the national church, that they were the supreme efforts of constructive art, was quite beside the question. It was enough that on utilitarian grounds they stood condemned. Neither of them was needed, either for a cathedral, as at Gloucester, or for a parish church, as at Tewkesbury. Why then should they any longer cumber the ground? Rather let them be swept away at once and their materials put to some more profitable use. So, at any rate, thought the man who was responsible for their destruction. Thomas, Lord Seymour of Sudeley, Lord High Admiral of England, and brother-in-law of the King. Both abbeys had been granted to him at the dissolution in 1539, and he was not the man to lose any time in making the most of his acquisition. It would no doubt be unfair to condemn him on this count alone. 9 out of 10 men in his day, estimable citizens enough according to their lights, would have done the same, but for Thomas Seymour it is impossible on any count to feel either sympathy or respect. So thoroughly were his orders in each case carried out that not a single stone of either church remains, and it has been only in recent years that excavations have discovered their foundations and given us indisputable evidence of their former splendour. The small parish church of Hales stands close beside the abbey. Originally built in the 12th century, it passed on the foundation of the monastery into the possession of the monks, and was much altered by them. The fragments of the original church which remain are the shafts of the chancel arch and the 2 pilasters which support the south chancel wall. The site is now looked after by English Heritage, who have a fascinating visitor centre where you can find out in detail about the remarkable history of the building and wander the cloisters imagining yourself overawed by the beauty of what used to be. We're heading up into the hills again now, into the woods, into the villages of Gwitting, and then north towards Broadway. This part of the Cotswolds is so beautiful, we're going to have a really nice journey. This village of Gwitting Power, or Lower Gwitting, features heavily in Evan's book. He describes the dilapidation of the place in 1902. The cottages were empty, unlet and unloved, the church almost a ruin. In 1903, however, money had been raised, restoration had begun, and the village and church started to take on the timeless beauty and peace it portrays today. This is absolutely classic Cotswold countryside. Sleepy, restful, honey-coloured. It's almost corny in its perfection. The church, standing at the end of the village, was almost completely restored in 1903, but a sign on the priest door reads, "At the restoration in 1903, this chancel doorway and small window were not disturbed." On the way to Broadway, we were tempted by the sign to Snow's Hill. I'm very glad we were. As we follow Evans's 1905 cycle ride round the amazing Cotswolds, and we read his book as we go, he often mentions that being adventurous pays off. He's suggesting that if you're travelling on your own and you're not in a big party, that it's worth going off the main roads to check out the little villages, and nothing illustrates this more dramatically than this extraordinary little village of Snow's Hill. Travelling north from the Gwittings, we dropped off the main road and into this tiny village nestled in the folds of the hills, and it's the most startlingly beautiful place you've ever seen. The church was actually built in Victorian times, so it's comparatively modern. It's an interesting story. No one's absolutely sure what happened to the original church in Snow's Hill. It seems to have disappeared, although they've clearly been worshipping here for many hundreds of years. It was built with an idea that it should have a spire on top, but the money ran out before that was built, and as a result you end up with this rather odd square-topped tower with no castellation and no real decoration on the top. It's an unusual thing, just penury, I'm afraid. This village is wonderful. Please don't come here unless you're travelling light, but it is so beautiful. If you are, it's worth a visit. Snow's Hill lives up to its name, and if there is snow in the Cotswolds, there will be snow here. It's also well known for its local lavender farms, one of which, I believe, supplies the Cotswold distillery with its lavender gin botanical. We're now heading north towards the wonderful town of Broadway. Now, Broadway is smaller than most of the other famous Cotswold towns, and it's right at the northern tip of the region. In fact, we're actually in Worcestershire, but we're surrounded on three sides by the rather more familiar Cotswold county of Gloucestershire. It's mainly famous for its beautiful high street, lined with chestnut trees and these golden, beautiful Cotswold stone buildings, and a plethora of shops, pubs, cafes and hotels. It's frankly worth visiting Broadway just for the high street. Filming as we are at 5 a.m. on a summer's day, you get a feeling for what it was that first attracted the group who became known as the Broadway Group to this pretty Worcestershire village. The rose-coloured buildings, mostly built with stone from the quarries on Broadway Hill to the south of us, give one an extraordinary sense of peace. The early morning sounds of the milkman making his deliveries, the delicatessen owner stacking his fresh produce onto ancient wooden market barrows and displaying them in front of his shop, and a small band of men in the apparently obligatory bright yellow coats picking up any detritus left from the previous day. This peaceful scene is probably as close as we'll get to that which Francis Millet, an expat American painter and illustrator, happened upon in the mid-1880s. It was perfect timing on Millet's part, for a fashion was developing in England for artists to gather in groups and form colonies away from the smelly, noisy and generally uninspiring life in the cities. They could be found in Cornwall, Yorkshire and Suffolk, as well as here in Broadway. Millais, a man blessed with some private wealth, first acquired Farnham House in Broadway to live in with his family, and shortly afterwards, when it became obvious that he'd be joined by many of his creative friends, he bought an old monastic ruin called Abbott's Grange, which he restored just enough to turn it into a studio where they could all work. Into this idyllic environment came the painters, John Singer Sargent, Edwin Abbey, Alfred Parsons, also a well-known garden designer and illustrator, George Borton, Edwin Bashfield, the English illustrator Fred Barnard, and the writers Henry James and Edmund Gosse. An impressive group if ever there was one. Gosse wrote of the Grange at the time, "A medieval ruin, a small ecclesiastical edifice, which was very roughly repaired so as to make it a kind of refuge for us. And there, in the morning, Henry James and I would write while Abbey and Millais painted on the floor below, and Sargent and Parsons tilted their easels just outside. We were all within shouting distance, and not much serious work was done, for we were in towering spirits, and everything was food for laughter. Henry James was the only sedate one of all, benign, indulgent but grave, and not often unbending beyond a genial chuckle." It does seem Henry James was the only calming influence amongst this rather rowdy group, and it's not clear how much of an influence he really had. In the best tradition of artistic communities, they were a lively and colourful bunch, confident in the value of creative life and the contribution they would make to the rest of the world. They were certainly not great contributors to the peace and tranquillity of Broadway. Edmund Gosse also wrote, "Nothing we do scandalises the villagers. Fred Barnard, with an enormous stage slouch hat over his shoulders, chased one of the Americans down the street. The man chased, screaming all the time and trying to escape up lamp-posts and down wells. Not a villager smiled. Whatever we do or say, wear or sing, they only say, 'Them Americans is out again.'" Now fully restored, the Grange is an extremely upmarket B&B, surely worth a visit. Towards the end of the 19th century, this community, like all those before and after, started to wear out. It's an inevitability that such passion and enthusiasm will wilt with time, but the legacy these young, rebellious and hugely creative people left behind is seen in the eyes of those thousands of people from all around the world who visit this village each year. The group dispersed. Abbey bought a house in Fairford, south of here, and was followed by Sargent and eventually Henry James. Millais was later to die in the Titanic disaster in 1912. Struggling up the escarpment to the south of the town, on a road called Fish Hill, it becomes clear why Broadway became a coaching stop for those travelling between Worcester and Oxford. The hill is extremely steep and would have required fresh horses to tackle it. Way up on the hill above Broadway is the Broadway Tower, which you see behind me. The original concept for this extraordinary building was had by Capability Brown, the famous 18th century landscape architect. It was put into practice by the 6th Earl of Coventry, who commissioned an architect called James Wyatt to design and build this rather remarkable small castle. It has a wonderful history. It was used by William Morris and his business as a retreat, and many other artists came here. We'll tell you a little bit about it as we look around. The tower has been inspirational for a variety of creative people. Thomas Phillips had his early printing press here. He was one of the greatest ever collectors of books and manuscripts. And many of the arts and crafts movement used the building as a kind of 19th century holiday let. The pre-Raphaelite artists Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris himself were frequent visitors, and it was here that Morris began his campaign for the preservation of historic monuments. Actually, hang on a minute, I do remember saying something similar about the church in Burford. Perhaps it's slightly tricky to be completely certain where these things begin. It has, however, one of the most extraordinary views in the country. It is said you can see 13 different counties from up here. From Broadway, we head northeast towards Chipping Campden, Winter is closing in and fur coats are the order of the day, but still the beauty of the Cotswolds shines through.
The name of this ancient settlement is Anglo-Saxon. Camp is the word for a settlement. Den is the word for a valley. So this means a settlement in a valley. The word chipping refers to the market that was awarded to this village in 1175 by King Henry II. Like many of these most beautiful of the villages in the Cotswolds, its beauty is partly down to its lack of commercial success. Very successful villages were redeveloped and constantly added to, but places like Chipping Campden that suffered something of a roller coaster of a history have remained as beautiful as ever right from the very beginning. We're going to show you around. Follow me.
At the beginning of the 17th century, Sir Baptist Hicks endowed one of the finest examples of Cotswold stone almshouses to provide accommodation for 6 poor men and 6 poor women who were given an annual allowance of 3 shillings and 4pence, a frieze gown, a ton of coal, and a felt hat. Albeit updated to meet 21st century requirements, they still provide inexpensive homes for 12 people. Originally, the water supply for the houses was from one outside tap, still visible in the wall of the pavement. Despite modernisation, however, their appearance remains almost completely unchanged.
This terrific example of local market buildings was built in 1627 for the princely sum of £90 by Sir Baptist Hicks, who was a merchant, a moneylender, and the first Lord Campden. It's a little startling how often we find, as we travel through the Cotswolds, that so many of the powerful people in the 14th and 15th centuries were payday lenders.
The old silk mill in Sheep Street was built in 1780. It specialised in throwing or spinning silk and went some way to replacing the jobs lost in the collapse of the wool trade. After the silk business in turn collapsed in 1860, the mill closed, not to reopen until 1902, when the Guild of Handicraft, part of William Morris's arts and crafts movement, relocated from London and set up shop. The silversmith Hicks is working in their original studio to this day. Probably occupied in the Bronze Age, and certainly familiar to the people of the Iron Age, Campden was settled by the Romans. West of the village, at the foot of Dover Hill, there's evidence of Roman villas and what seems likely to be man-made terracing built for a Roman vineyard. Set in a natural amphitheatre formed by the folds of the Cotswolds, Dover Hill is the site of the annual Dover's Games, known nowadays as the Cotswold Olympics. They started in 1612, and apart from the odd hiatus as a result of the increasingly drunken behaviour of visitors, these games have been held ever since. Today they take place on the Friday following Whitsunday, and encompass many rural sports, including the ancient and painful activity of shin kicking. In around 1610, the manor of Campden was bought by one Sir Baptist Hicks, and shortly afterwards he set about building a grand country house that befit his status, and he styled himself the first Lord Campden. He doesn't seem to have spent much time here, and when he died in 1629, the house and estate passed to his daughter Juliana. In January 1645, during the Civil War, Campden was occupied by Royalist troops under Colonel Henry Bard, who urgently set about the fortification of the house. However, in May the same year, the garrison was moved westwards, and seemingly in order to avoid the newly fortified house falling into the hands of the parliamentarians, it was set alight and razed to the ground. No doubt a good deal of the stone will have been reused in the building of the village of Campden, and now all that's left is a few ruins, the spectacular gates, and the 2 Jacobean banqueting houses, now under the care of the Landmark Trust, who make them available as holiday lets.
Behind me is the Church of St. James, Chipping Campden, one of the single most spectacular of all the wool churches in the Cotswolds. This is a range of churches paid for largely out of the proceeds of the wool industry. This is one of the most spectacular of all. There was a Norman church on this site originally, slightly squat with a square tower, But around 1260, the transformation from that into what you see behind me started, when it was to take nearly 250 years.
We're heading southeast now, seemingly miraculously in much better weather, towards Morton-in-Marsh. I've got into such trouble for calling it Morton-in-the-Marsh over the years. Please forgive me for any slips of the tongue. The first evidence of human settlement at what we now know as Morton-in-Marsh dates to the Bronze Age. But following the Roman invasion, the Roman armies began building the Fosse Way, a major road that runs from Exeter to Lincoln. It was completed by the end of the 1st century and passes through Morton-in-the-Marsh, the original Roman road lying just a few feet below the present surface of the High Street. By the 11th century, the town was the property of Westminster Abbey, and from 1222 to 1226, the abbot began developing Morton as a market town, creating the wide High Street for this purpose. In the late 1220s, building of the town began on common land bordering the Fosse Way to the northwest of the original Saxon settlement. The town in this period was mainly agricultural, sheep being the most important source of income. The town avoided any direct involvement in the Civil War, although King Charles I did stay a night at the White Hart Inn in 1644, and Oliver Cromwell stayed in Morton in 1651 to take communion with the Baptists. Curfew Tower, at the junction of High Street and Oxford Street, was probably built in the 16th century and has a curfew bell in its turret, with a small room at its base that was once used as a lock-up. By the 17th century, the town's population was around 500. The establishment of a linen weaving factory in 1742 encouraging further growth. Morton's several inns offered shelter to travellers passing through, and at one point in the 1820s, some 70 coaches were rolling through this town each week. The opening of a horse-drawn tramway to Stratford-on-Avon in 1826, followed by the mainline railway from Worcester to Oxford in 1853, created a further increase in population. The First and Second World Wars affected Morton significantly, with the loss of many young local men, commemorated on the town's High Street War Memorial. RAF Morton-in-Marsh, the inspiration for the Much Binding in the Marsh radio comedy show that ran from 1944 to 1954, was constructed to the east of the town in 1939 for the training of Wellington bomber crews. The town continued to modernise and develop following the Second World War, and has for some time been one of the principal growth areas of the North Cotswolds. The 21st century has seen considerable housing development in and around Morton, with the railway and 2 trunk roads busier than ever before. The locals are beginning to ask the question, just how much more expansion can the town's existing infrastructure cope with?
Well, we've had an interesting trip around Morton-in-Marsh. It's clearly a very busy place. Even at the crack of dawn when we film, it's noisy and full of activity. There's a great sense of life here. We've had a nice time. There are clearly some very good hotels to stay in. It's worth a visit.
For episode 4 of our compilations, we'll be starting in the amazing villages of Upper and Lower Slaughter, going south through Bolton-on-the-Water, and following Evans to North Leach and east to Burford and Witney. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to subscribe to the channel by clicking on the button below, and we'll see you shortly.